Hello, and welcome back to another podcast of Lifestyle School, where we break down the science of healthy living and give you practical steps to improve your life. I am your host, Hope Plack, and today we're diving into a topic that impacts nearly everyone, and that topic is wheat. Have you ever wondered if the wheat that you're eating is different from what your grandparents grew up eating? Spoiler alert, it is. And the changes that happened over the past 75 years are actually quite shocking. Today, we're going to break down exactly how wheat was transformed, the surprising impact on its protein structure, and what that means for your health. Plus, we're going to cover the controversial role of pesticides, Monsanto, and glyphosate, and what you can do to reduce your exposure. And while we'll explore how modern wheat processing methods like bleaching and refining have impacted digestion and nutrient content. By the end of this episode, my goal is that you will feel like an expert on modern wheat. But before we dive in, let me make it very clear this podcast is for educational purposes only. I am not a doctor, and this is not medical advice. Always talk to your healthcare provider before making any medical changes to your diet, especially if you have underlying health conditions. So, with that, let's get started. If you know much about me, I have been in the nutrition space for about 10 years now, and I have actually been gluten-free since 2008. And so wheat has been an issue that I have thought about for quite some time. I was actually a senior in high school in 2008. And my story began with exercise-induced asthma. I was playing basketball. I was a starting player, and the goal was to play a lot during my games. And after about 6 minutes, I would no longer be able to breathe, have a really hard time catching my breath, and we were looking into exercise-induced asthma because it seemed like it was getting pretty bad. I was really blessed. My dad is a functional medicine doctor. He is the same doctor that I worked with for 8 years after I had my nutritional training in his functional medicine clinic. And he suggested, as a senior in high school, that I go gluten-free. Now, a little backstory. My mother and my father had been gluten-free for quite a long time. I grew up in the 90s going to obscure food co-ops to find the most disgusting gluten-free bread you could ever imagine eating because my mom had been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, ulcerative colitis, back in the 80s. So I was familiar with gluten. I had eaten it in our household growing up, and then at some point, I don't remember exactly when, my parents had pulled it from our diet at home, but as a teenager with my own car, my own cash, I definitely indulged in some gluten. So I decided, you know what, basketball is really important to me. I'll give it a shot. And to my surprise, within a couple of weeks, I went from being able to play 6 minutes, maybe, to being able to play almost a whole half, like a whole 20-minute half without barely coming out for a break. I lost 20 pounds, which I wasn't overweight, but I wasn't, I would say, super fit prior to removing gluten. Retrospectively, I realized that I did have some digestion disturbances. When you're, 17 years old, you're not really like paying that close attention, but I realized that I had some bloating, some inflammation. And yeah, I removed gluten from my diet. Back then, no one even knew what gluten was. I would say, I'm going gluten free. And they'd be like, what does that even mean? And yeah, I felt so much better. I had so much more energy, mental clarity, and so on. Then fast forward a couple years, I'm in college. I am, taking a huge course load, working multiple jobs. I start eating in the school cafeteria, and what do you know? I start eating gluten again. All of the problems come back. So once again, I figure out, okay, this gluten thing just like doesn't work for me, so we need to be done. And since then, I have really tried to be very intentional to remain gluten-free. And my children now are also gluten-free because I've found that it just works best for our health and our digestive systems. But, I think it's really an interesting conversation because coming from the functional medicine world, I did all the nutritional coaching for the clients at my dad's office. And one of the first things when people were having digestive issues, autoimmune conditions, inflammatory issues, is we'll suggest they remove gluten from their diet. There is testing that we can do to see if your body's reacting to the proteins in gluten and gliadin. But just as I would say a general consensus within the functional medicine field, if you're having issues, the first things to be recommended to go is typically gluten. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we're going to kind of dive into that today. And I'm really excited about this conversation because, I do think it comes up a lot. People are like, well, my grandmother, she ate gluten, like she didn't have any problem. Why is everyone today gluten free? Is it just a fad? Is it a trend? People are going gluten free to be trendy. And I think those are, reasonable explanations. I think a lot of people do things because it's cool, it's in the culture. But I do think there is evidence to suggest why more people are finding that, gluten just doesn't work for them. And I think that's okay. And I think we should be sensitive to people who don't do well with gluten, even if they're not celiac, which celiac is an autoimmune condition. And typically people are much more reactive. So the big difference between someone who has celiac versus someone who has a gluten sensitivity is celiac disease is like you have gluten, someone next to you has gluten, like you could have a huge inflammatory response. And, it differs from individual to individual, but these people have to be extremely, extremely careful for like really small things like cross-contamination. Where someone with a gluten sensitivity are going to have a varying degree of reactivity. Some people they eat it, maybe they have a stomach ache. Someone else, maybe they get a migraine, maybe they have hives, maybe they have, issues like a day or two later. Because with a food sensitivity, you can react to a food up to 72 hours after you eat it, which can make it really also hard for people to identify food sensitivities. But that's a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But yeah, so this is why I think this is like a really fun topic because I think this is a genuine question that many people have. It's a genuine question I get for my own personal, like, why do I not eat gluten? As well as clients when I recommend, hey, maybe you should try cutting this out and see how you feel. One thing I will say, if you are thinking about cutting out gluten, you need to cut it out for at least 3 months to really know how your body is doing. One, I will say it's can be really difficult to actually remove gluten from your diet because it's like in so many products. So you have to be very mindful of that. And then secondly, gluten residue likes to hang out in your intestines for a long time. Um, I read this a very long time ago, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I read that it can stay in your system for up to 9 months after. So 3 months minimum, take it out, and then, maybe try to reintroduce it. See how you feel. If you're having bloating, if you're having any sorts of reactions to it, whether it's immediately or maybe a couple days delayed, that's something that's your body telling you, hey, we're having a really hard time with this food protein. Maybe we need to keep it out of our diet for a longer period of time, or maybe long term based on what you're going to learn today. So let's dive into just like a little backstory on wheat and what has happened to it over the last 75 years. So we're going to go back in time. For centuries, wheat was a staple food around the world, but the wheat that was grown and eaten before 1950 is vastly different from what we consume today. So what happened? And the answer really lies in this time that was called the Green Revolution. It's a period of agricultural transformation that began in the 1940s and then, expanded through the 1960s. So during this time, there was a scientist named Norman Borlaug. I think I'm saying that right. And he set out to solve a massive global crisis, which was food shortages. And you got to remember, this is like post World War II. There was issues throughout the world. And in response, Borlaug developed a semi-dwarf wheat. It's a shorter stalk. It's sturdier. And the variety that it produced, this semi-dwarf wheat, was much higher yields than traditional wheat plants. So this breakthrough increased wheat production worldwide and it helped prevent widespread famine, which at the time, was very, very important. But how did Borlaug achieve this? Well, he used crossbreeding, so not genetic modification, which I want to be clear, our wheat, I think there's some confusion around this. It is not genetically modified, our wheat, but it is crossbred. There's a key distinction there. And the process, it's a process, excuse me, apparently I can't talk, guys. So he used crossbreeding, a process that combines different wheat strains to produce a plant with desired traits. So here's what happened during the crossbreeding process, and I hope you think this is as interesting as I do. So Borlaug crossbred traditional wheat plants with Norin 10, which is a Japanese dwarf wheat variety. This produced wheat plants with the shorter stalks that could support larger, heavier grain heads without the wheat falling over. These shorter stalked allowed the plants to be fertilized heavily without lodging, also known as falling over, which dramatically boosted the crop yields. It sounds great, right? But there were some unintended consequences to this crossbreeding of the wheat germs or the wheat plants, seeds. I guess I'm not 100% sure what the technical term of that would be. So during this extensive crossbreeding process, the genetic makeup of wheat changed quite significantly. Modern wheat has undergone countless generations of selective breeding, and while this increased yield and disease resistance, it also altered the protein structure of the wheat. So here is what changed. Modern wheat contains more gluten, and this is, what nowadays we hear about all the time. Everyone knows what gluten is, everything. If it doesn't contain gluten, even if it doesn't have wheat in it, it says gluten-free, even if like none of the products in it naturally contain gluten, which I think is kind of hilarious. But modern wheat contains more gluten, specifically a type of gluten called gliadin. I don't know if you've heard of that one before, but it's one of the main proteins found in wheat. Gliadin is what gives bread its elasticity, but it's also the most inflammatory component for people with gluten sensitivities or digestive issues. So, I know it's kind of like popular to be like a girly with digestive distress, but we don't actually want this because this is our body sending us alarm bells saying, hey, like something's not right, right? So wheat's glutenin content also increased. Glutenin is the protein that gives dough its strength and chewiness. And while this makes modern wheat ideal for industrial baking, it's harder to break down in our digestive system. Makes sense. New strains of wheat now contain more complex gluten bonds, which may contribute to higher rates of leaky gut. If you've heard of that term before, leaky gut is essentially microscopic holes in the lining of your small intestine, which allows food proteins to leak into your bloodstream, which then can trigger an immune response, which is why leaky gut is closely connected to autoimmune issues, because autoimmune issues are where your immune system is triggered and is attacking your own cells instead of, foreign pathogens like it's supposed to. So these gluten bonds contribute to leaky gut, autoimmune issues, obviously not surprising, and then also digestive discomfort. So in other words, we consume today is vastly different on a molecular level from what our ancestors ate. We have more gluten, stronger proteins, and new genetic strains have all contributed to modern wheat's impact on our digestive system and our health. So beyond crossbreeding, modern wheat is also processed in a very different way than it was in the past generations. And I think this is a really important note. The wheat we buy in the stores today is often refined, bleached, and stripped of nutrients. So I grew up in a very crunchy household, and I actually did a lot of cooking as I was growing up. I was also homeschooled. You maybe didn't know that about me. But my mom went through this phase where she wanted me to make bread. This was before we were gluten-free. So she had bought whole grain I'm blanking on what they're called, but she bought like the actual wheat grain, and then we had a flour mill, so I'd grind it in our mill, and then I would take that wheat that I just ground and I'd make it into bread. And I don't think at this point we actually had a KitchenAid, so I had to knead it by hand, and this process took a lot of time. And one thing that I will tell you is like the way that I ground that wheat, it was not anywhere near like the wheat that you'd buy in the store that's like perfectly powdery white, bleach refined grain. It looked totally different. And this is, I think, an important piece of this puzzle. So here's what happened. During the processing, the bran, also known as the fiber, and the germ, which is the nutrient-rich core, are removed, leaving only the starchy endosperm. This process gives wheat a longer shelf life, but drastically reduces its nutritional value. Wheat flour is often bleached using chemicals like chlorine dioxide and benzoyl peroxide to give it a bright white appearance. That is something I've also noticed is the color was not the same when I was grinding my own wheat. Thankfully, my mom, I will say this, it's kind of like a sidebar, but at first we had a hand grinder and then my mom upgraded to an electric grinder and I was so thankful. My forearms, my biceps were so thankful. I was probably like 12 at this time. So while this may improve its look, bleaching further degrades the flour's nutrient content and may leave behind chemical residues. So you have your wheat with a side of chlorine dioxide and benzoyl peroxide potentially, which sounds delicious. The refining process makes modern wheat easier to use in large-scale commercial baking, but far less beneficial for digestion. Refined wheat products are rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream, leading to blood sugar spikes, which is something we talk about a lot here in lifestyle school. And what this does, it increases your cravings and potential insulin resistance over time. So, really important things to know. In addition, refined wheat is often fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals to replace the nutrients lost during processing. But these added nutrients are not as bioavailable as those found in whole, unprocessed grains. So, the combination of higher gluten content and refined wheat flour may explain why so many people experience digestive discomfort from modern wheat. And, one thing about this that I will say, I was actually just at the grocery store last night looking at the bread aisle. My husband was going hiking with a friend. My husband does not always eat gluten-free, unfortunately, and his friend does not either. And so I was making sandwiches for them to take on their big hike. And so I ran to Safeway, and I don't typically buy bread at Safeway because, I typically only buy gluten-free bread, and I'll get that at somewhere like Whole Foods or Trader Joe's typically. So I was searching all over the store for the bread aisle, finally found it, and I was just looking at the different bread varieties, and it was so interesting because you have, something white and fluffy like Wonder Bread where it's like so soft. If you like actually pick up the loaf, it's really light. And then there's something like the organic whole grain. I think it's called Dave's bread, but it's like really dense. Like you can tell there's just way more to it. And I think so much of that comes to the processing of the grains that are in that bread. And so it's like if you've actually looked at bread, like think of Ezekiel bread versus Wonder Bread. Like they're not even comparable, right? You can tell one is like way more refined, is going to have way less nutritional value, probably is very bleached versus the other one that's a little bit more left alone is going to be a little bit more like maybe what you'd have if you were making bread in your own kitchen with whole grain flour. So just something to think about when you find yourself looking for bread next time. Moving on, I want to talk about pesticides. Okay, so let's go get into like a more even concerning part of the conversation when it comes to wheat production, and that is pesticides. So I don't know if you've heard of a company called Monsanto, but they are a company that makes pesticides, herbicides, insecticides. And they developed glyphosate-resistant wheat strains in the early 2000s. It was never approved for commercial use, so these GMO seeds were never approved for commercial use. But here's the catch. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Monsanto's Roundup, is still heavily used in wheat farming. And this should be an alarm bell for all of you. And we're going to get into why in just a minute. So, farmers use glyphosate in two ways. They use it before planting to kill weeds and prepare the field. This isn't what this podcast specifically is about, but our topsoil here in the US is like essentially dying. We have less nutrients in the soil. It's becoming extremely depleted due to monocropping, and spraying our fields with pesticides, specifically glyphosate, is a huge problem with this, as well as glyphosate then getting into our waterways and into our water and all of this. It's a huge thing. I could do a whole podcast just on that topic, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. So we spray our fields with glyphosate prior to planting, and then they're also sprayed before harvest as a drying agent, also known as desiccation. I think I'm saying that right. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So this second practice is where things get problematic when it comes to glyphosate being on our wheat. When wheat is sprayed with glyphosate just before harvest, it absorbs higher levels of the chemical. And this is legal in the United States and Canada, but I want to make sure you know that it's banned in Europe due to the concerns about glyphosate residues in food. The result, the EU refuses to import most U.S. wheat due to its stricter food safety standards, which prohibits glyphosate residues in grains. So to be clear, the EU does not allow glyphosate residue in grains because it's been deemed not safe. Here in the US, our government has said it's safe. You can have glyphosate. These companies, who have so many lobbyists in DC have had their way. Anyway, you can maybe tell how I feel about that. This has significantly impacted the US wheat exports to Europe. And just a general note on this, because I know this has been something that's been coming up in the news a lot with RFK Jr. becoming the head of the HHS. He, had his presidential campaign. I will just say on the record, I have followed RFK Jr. for 10 plus years, and I'm really excited to have him in a big role in government in this way because our food system is so messed up. We need reform. We need changes. I personally don't think lobbying in the way that it's done in DC should be allowed. I do think there should be term limits for people because that would help our representatives work on behalf of us if they knew they wouldn't be there after 4 years. I think our food system just needs a great big overhaul. I think we need to clean up a lot of the science in this and a lot of the lobbying and a lot of the corporate run regulatory agencies. There, I said it. So anyway, that's like a total sidebar, but the European Union does not allow for glyphosate in their food. I think they allow only like 400 chemicals in their food total. In the US, our FDA has allowed over 10,000 chemicals that are pretty much unregulated. So, this is something we could talk about on another episode, but we're just going to kind of scratch the surface here and keep on going for the sake of time in this episode. So in the past decade, there have actually been thousands of lawsuits that have been filed against Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, which is a German company, claiming that glyphosate exposure has contributed to cancer diagnoses, particularly non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And some of the most notable cases include in 2018, a California jury awarded a $289 million award to Dwayne Johnson, a groundskeeper who claimed his terminal cancer was caused by glyphosate exposure. And actually, RFK Jr. was the one to head up that lawsuit. And that was a huge win. Currently, if you follow Glyphosate Girl on Instagram, there is a huge push that Monsanto and Bayer and these manufacturers of herbicides, pesticides, and insecticides are trying to lobby for protections from these claims from harm due to the chemicals that are being sprayed on our food. They don't want to be held liable. So they're looking for protections similar to the protections that vaccine manufacturers have. So if you want to get involved in that, if you think that shouldn't be allowed, if safety is a priority for you with your food, over profits for big companies, I would suggest going over to Instagram, typing in glyphosate girl, and I believe her name is Kelly. She's actually lives somewhere here in California, not far from me. She kind of leads a charge on that, and she's doing some really great work. So shout out to her. In 2019, a U.S. court awarded a $2 billion award to a couple who claimed glyphosate caused their cancer. The ruling was later reduced, but it has underscored the growing concern about glyphosate's safety. And then in 2020, Bayer agreed to pay over $10 billion to settle tens of thousands of glyphosate-related lawsuits. So here's a quick note. If you have Roundup in your shed to kill weeds, you got to get rid of it. It's so incredibly toxic. You don't want it on your lawn, and you don't want your kids playing in your lawn after you have sprayed these really horrible chemicals around your house. We definitely don't want it in our food. Can you get on board with that? My hope is yes. So despite these cases, what's really mind-boggling is that Bayer maintains that glyphosate is safe when used properly. And it's kind of wild. So let's kind of shift now to the good news, because that is pretty heavy. There are steps you can take to reduce your exposure to harmful pesticides, specifically when you're trying to buy, bread or wheat containing products. So choosing organic wheat, organic certified products, prohibit the use of glyphosate and excuse me, I keep burping. It's just so embarrassing. I'm trying to record a podcast. The organic certification on products prohibits the use of glyphosate and synthetic pesticides. Try doing something like ancient grains like einkorn, emmer, and spelt are closer to their original form and are typically easier to digest because they haven't had, that crossbreeding. Or look for glyphosate-free brands. Some companies now test and label their products accordingly. Or go for something that's, made with organic wheat, but is a sourdough bread. The fermentation process in sourdough naturally reduces both the gluten content and might help break down any pesticide residues that might still be in or on the wheat. So to wrap things up here, modern wheat production has changed dramatically, and unfortunately, those changes haven't always been for the better. By understanding these changes and making smarter choices, you can reduce your exposure both to harmful chemicals while still enjoying the foods you love. So, as I leave you today, I just want to say thank you so much for tuning into Lifestyle School. If you have questions about wheat, about gluten, about pesticides, leave them in the comments here. I'd love to hear from you guys. Or come on over to Instagram, Hope Platt Coaching, and engage with me over there. I always love to hear from you. If you thought this episode was helpful, the questions that you have, please let me know your thoughts. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. That helps me get the word out to more people and lets people know online that we're here trying to provide this content for you. So I just want to encourage you as you go on your week, stay curious, keep making choices that nourish your body and your mind. Until next time, have a good one.